All right, so again, now we're going to talk about the economic statement conversion so that we can forecast the cash flows and value the companies. So the graphic on this slide we're going to use a lot, and it's a graphical representation of Modigliani-Miller. And as I said, what it really represents is a process for valuation, where we take the cash flows and we put them into operating and non-operating, and then we add the two together, get enterprise value, and that equals the debt and equity equivalent cash flows. So the idea is, where can I do this? Well, we're going to use a sorry, I've lost my mind today. We're going to use a mnemonic for each one of these buckets to help us keep our rearranging of these financials straight. So for our purposes, and this is just something I have created personally to help me understand this and explain this, so if you go to anybody else with what we're about to say, they're going to look at you like you're crazy, right? But the point is, in this class, we're going to call operating cash flows ones, and we're going to call non-operating cash flows twos, and we're going to call debt equivalent cash flows threes, and we're going to call equity equivalent cash flows fours. So 1 plus 2 equals enterprise value. 3 plus 4 equals enterprise value. 1 plus 2 equals 3 plus 4. All right? Matter of fact, enterprise DCF valuation, 1 plus 2 minus 3 equals 4. Right? Now, the reason why we're going to use a mnemonic is to conceptually show you what we're about to do. You can think about this graphic. So the idea is that we are going to start with the accounting statements. We're going to rearrange them into economic statements, and it will be these economic statements which will help us do a valuation. So we'll start out with the balance sheet. So we're going to take a balance sheet and we're going to basically strip it apart and put it back together into this economic McKinsey-based format. And it's going to create a statement called TFI, Total Funds Available to Investors, or Total Funds Invested. And the idea is that it's just a rearranged balance sheet. And the metaphor that I continue to use in this class is that if you've ever done something with a bunch of Legos, let's say you get a bunch of Legos and you rip apart the Legos and you put the Legos back together, there can't be any Legos on the floor. So we have to account for every item in the balance sheet and rearrange it. And what we're really doing is we're mapping the balance sheet to the Modigliani-Miller model. So we'll go through the balance sheet. We'll label everything operating a 1. We'll aggregate our operating items together, operating assets minus operating liabilities. And that's going to get us something called invested capital. Then we're going to take all the non-operating 2s. And again, we will aggregate all of them together, and we'll have our non-operating assets minus our non-operating liabilities. Those two together are total funds available to investors. We'll then go through the balance sheet. Anything that's a debt equivalent that we've labeled a 3, we then write down. And anything that's an equity equivalent cash flow, we write down. And those will also add up to TFI. Okay? So really what we're doing is we're remapping the balance sheet to the Modigliani-Miller model, to this 4-bucket model. Right? We're going to do the same thing with the income statement. Everything that's operating on the income statement, no plat. Everything that's non-operating on the income statement, non-operating income. Add the two together, the statement is going to be called TII, Total Income Available to Investors. Then we're going to take the debt cash flows off the income statement and the equity cash flows off the income statement and rearrange those. Debt and equity, TII as well. I make this much income, I can pay it to the debt and equity holders. I'm losing money, this is how much the debt and equity holders would have to contribute in order to make up for my losses. Okay, so this is what we're going to accomplish first. Then we'll create the cash flow statement. It's called CFI, cash flow available to investors. Again, mapped to the Modigliani-Miller format. Cash flow is cash from the income statement minus change in the balance sheet. So we're going to do that process 4 times. What is free cash flow? It's the operating items. So it's the operating items from the income statement minus the change in the operating items in the balance sheet. So basically no plat minus change in invested capital. Free cash flow. Non-operating items from the income statement minus change in non-operating items on the balance sheet. Non-operating cash flow. Add those two together, cash flow available to investors. What does that equal? Debt payments to the debt holders off the income statement, change in debt on the balance sheet. Cash flow to the debt holders. Payments to the equity holders, change in equity, cash flow to the equity holders. Debt and equity cash flow also equals CFI. So one of the other things that we're going to do in this class that is unique to this class is we are going to balance the statements. If you learned free cash flow in every other class, they taught you free cash flow and they stopped. What we're going to do is we're not going to stop. We're going to rearrange all of the statements, see how much cash flow we generated, and then see where we spent it. And we're going to get it to foot so that these sides of the statements have to equal each other. And that will be powerful yet frustrating, because when they don't balance, it gets really frustrating. But they have to balance because we're taking statements that balance and we reorganize them, and they still have to balance when we finish reorganizing them. And that's the point. We're accounting for everything on the statement. But here's the idea, is once we have the cash flow in this format, if you forecast the free cash flows, operating value. If you forecast the non-operating cash flows, non-operating value. Forecast, add the two together, enterprise value, which is the same thing as forecasting the CFIs. Forecast the debt cash flows, total cash flow to debt holders. Forecast the equity cash flows, total cash flow to equity holders, or enterprise value minus debt equals equity. So again, what we're really doing is following the Modigliani-Miller methodology, mapping the statements, and then watching the cash flow fall through. What most people do is they go directly to here to here. And we're just doing these intermediate steps. And you might say, gee, why do we do an intermediate step? No plat divided by invested capital is ROIC. Makes doing ROIC analysis real easy. Non-operating. Here's my operating ROI. Here's my non-operating ROI. Here's the average ROI of the business. This is when I gave you the Molson Coors example last week. This is the ROIC that Bloomberg reports. This is the ROIC that you learned in every other class. It's the cash flow to debt and equity. Okay? Except if you think about it conceptually, it includes the operating and the non-operating. So most people don't break out operating and non-operating. By putting the cash flows into this format, operating ROIC, non-operating ROIC, average ROIC for the whole company. So what this will do is it will give us more insight to a level of granularity we don't typically see with the statements. And number two, it actually does make the analysis pretty straightforward because these buckets are then pretty consistently set up to work throughout all the statements, and then all the data to calculate stuff is already there. So it's more work up front, but it does make your lives easier later, and it gives you cleaner, more straightforward, less prone to mistake valuations. Because the problem with free cash flow is that if I don't calculate the rest of the cash flows, I could make a mistake in my free cash flow and not ever know it. So if I just calculate free cash flow and I don't balance it to show where that money went, I could leave something off or add something in by mistake and have no idea that I've made a mistake. So by doing it this way, I'm less likely to make a mistake because I had to force both sides of the equation to balance. All right, let's start out with the balance sheet. So basically, what's going to be important in the reorganized balance sheet is we're going to reorganize the balance sheet into its 4 categories. And it doesn't matter whether we start with the balance sheet or income statement first, but what does matter is we will have to do both statements before we can do cash flow. So cash flow is income statement minus change in balance sheet. We have to do the income statement